Thank you all very much for being here. I think Julia got in touch with me after one of my more embarrassing moments, I think, was I was on radio, I was on the ABC.
You're on the minefield.
I was on the minefield, and it was indeed a minefield because, you know, halfway through Walid Ali, we were talking about the French elections and the left and the right and did they exist anymore and all these kind of debates that you're familiar with. And in fact, he said, well, look, if you were in charge of the left, what would you do? And yeah, if that's not the million-dollar question, I don't know what is. But so I kind of paused, and there was this pause on air and some what they call white noise, or dead air on radio, which of course isn't great. And I want to return to that, so I'm going to leave that pregnant pause hanging in mid-air until about halfway through the talk. Where I know that we're responding today to the question, you know, what do people want from government? And so I've structured today's talk around two sub-questions, if you like. The first is slightly inverting that question and saying, well, do people want government? And I'm going to do that by reflecting on the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, well, Great Britain, in the election that's coming up Thursday week. So I'll be talking a little bit about that and thinking about that. And then come back to Walid Ali's question that, you know, if I was king of the left, you see I'm assuming it's a constitutional monarchy, but, you know, it's a debate for another time. But, you know, if I was king of the left, what would I do? So when I ask the question, do people want government? This isn't an anarchist manifesto. I'm not about to make that change, but rather to start thinking about the fracturing of the party system that took particular forms under conditions of prosperity in the post-war years. And you'll all be familiar with this particular important period in liberal democratic history. It's the 30 years, the Trente Glorieuses, as they call them in France, after the end of the Second World War, longest sustained period of growth in human history, and it came with all sorts of goodies like welfare states and things like that that really sustained people and provided some of the things that Peter was talking about, stability at work, housing, all those kind of securities. And I would suggest that in some ways that is Banquo's ghost at the feast. The memory of that embedded liberalism conditions all our responses, in some ways helpful, in some ways not. To give you a personal example, my grandfather worked in an Electrolux factory in Luton in England, and I was shocked to discover in talking to my mum a few years ago that he would not only come home for his lunch at lunchtime, you know, he had a lunch hour for a start, so he'd not only come home for his lunch, he'd have a nap afterwards. I couldn't believe that. Can you imagine? And I have fallen asleep in my office once, but I can assure you that was through exhaustion rather than just a kind of a regular nap, right? So in a way that sounds fantastic, doesn't it? If only we could go back to those kind of working conditions. And I'm not emphasising this because there are downsides to being his generation as well. He did lose 3 fingers in an industrial accident in his 20s, so it wasn't all that terrific. But nevertheless, I think that period of embedded liberalism and the welfare state really kind of hangs over us. And we're quite far from that now. I mean, we know the pressures on welfare states in Europe. A very short-lived attempt at getting one up in the United States. Here, there's pressure on it too. But what we're into now, I think, is what Peter Mayer has called the void. You know, the idea of governing the void. This notion that we're in a period of political narrowcasting rather than broadcasting. Again, to take that sort of, you know, metaphor of broadcasting, you know, from the age of the embedded liberalism, when lots of people would watch the same television programs and listen to the same radios, and it would create a sense of community. And now we're into kind of the narrowcasting associated with social media, and we think we know what kind of effects that have on people's attitudes and the sense they get of only speaking to people with their own views. So I think the UK election provides an interesting case study in this regard, because this fracturing has troubled the left more than the right. So the Conservative Party, I'm always amazed when I reflect on Brexit that of all the political parties that came out the worst of this, it was the Labour Party. I mean, we've got to remember that Brexit was a historic failure of government. It was the biggest loss of markets in, since Indian independence, or possibly even American independence. It's on that scale. But who came out the worst? The Labour Party. But I suppose there are sort of grounds for optimism here, because I think at least that period of valence politics, of the idea of just the economy, there's been this convergence on the economy, and it means that there was very little choice. People used to complain. It was a depoliticising or demobilising element in British politics, was that there was no real choice. But we can't say that at this election. There is quite a clear choice between the Conservatives and Labour, and indeed the SNP, the Scottish National Party, for different reasons. So actually the Labour Party now is providing an alternative to that permanent austerity associated with the Conservatives, but it's also providing an alternative to its Blairite years. So it's providing an alternative to its own past as well. And this is a big problem for the Labour Party in the United Kingdom. People often say, well, what's wrong with the left? And one answer in 2 words is Tony Blair. The Labour Party never really got over its 13 years of government, leading to another question, well, what is the Labour Party in the United Kingdom for? Is it actually to attain power? Isn't that not the basic point of parties, that they should eventually get into opposition, get into government? Or is the Labour Party just becoming like a big version of say, the Australian Democrats or the Liberal Democrats in the United Kingdom, that at best might hope for some sort of coalition position? It's a principled opposition, but it's nothing. It's never really going to get into government. Corbyn's Labour seem to operate in the latter sense, although strangely enough, the polls are closing quite rapidly. In a way that I don't think even their strategists imagined at the beginning of the campaign. If you look at where Jeremy Corbyn popped up in terms of his campaigning in the first 2 weeks, he seemed to be preaching to the converted. He was going to constituencies in which his supporters in the Parliamentary Labour Party were campaigning. Right? And so what's happened subsequently is he's adopted a different idiom and a different language, and he's actually sort of doing better than that, and he's campaigning in different places as well. Polling day next Thursday would be to see how much of the popular vote Corbyn's Labour achieves. Right? If he gets more than 30%, even if he doesn't win the election, because of the way the seats are spread out, if he gets above 30%, he's doing better than Miliband and Brown before him, which of course will mean what happens to the Labour Party afterwards will be in quite a different light, because a lot of Blairites in the Labour Party are waiting for a massive election loss. The one thing that they will take from that is, well, we can get rid of Corbyn. But if he does better than 30%, I think there's questions about whether he will have to stay, or one of his allies will take the place for him. And this, of course, is a great fear of those kind of Labour parliamentarians, or at least the Blairite wing, who fear a sort of Dantesque existence. The only thing I can think of is like a scene from Dante's Purgatory, where every generation the Labour Party will write a long suicide note in the form of a manifesto, and then eventually they'll come back, and after a generation they'll get a leader, but it hollows out the party and their party membership collapses. So they're almost sort of stuck in this cycle. So is there an alternative, and does the British or the English electorate really want that? The alternative, of course, is what the Conservatives have been banging on about: strong and stable government. This slogan has been used ad nauseum through the campaign. There's an element in this campaign of what I'm calling it's almost like a khaki election. It's framed as a great national moment, and that we need strong leadership to see us through the crisis, and that's how Theresa May has been going. May and that message are supported by the structure of the British system of government itself. I mean, the British system one of its virtues was claimed that it used to be able to deliver comfortable majorities. And the Conservatives saw themselves as the party to do this, with the occasional correction delivered by Labour governments. Out of the 40 72 post-war years since 1945, 42 have been under a Labour government, under a Conservative government, 30 under Labour, even though Labour Party's only enjoyed 4 periods of government itself. But what the Conservatives think people want doesn't always translate into good electoral politics, and I think some of Peter's research would be germane to that. We think of the so-called dementia tax. Strong and stable government in terms of Brexit also seemed to come with yet more austerity aimed at people who were sort of most vulnerable, if you like, in society, and that backfired quite badly. And we saw even just yesterday that Theresa May was forced to defend that backflip in well, we can't call them debates, the televised discussions, I think would be the way to put them. Now, on to the populist dimension of this, because this election, in a way, could see the end of populism, or at least the right-wing populism that has dominated our thinking since 2010, since the Eurozone crisis, well, a little bit beforehand maybe, and the rise of the UK Independence Party, particularly since 2009 and 2014. Unlike Australia, there's a difference with the Australian case, because this fraying of the vote has taken place within the main left-wing party. It's not seen a rise in support for the Greens, as we've seen here, and that's partly, I think, because in the United Kingdom, of course, if you don't like any party, you don't have to vote. You know, your vote can go nowhere, and we see that quite often. You know, when parties are on the nose. Conservatives in '97, 2 million people just didn't bother to turn up to vote for them, and something might be happening similar for the Labour Party. The populist dimension of this phenomenon resulted in not the Greens but the UK Independence Party, and there's an important point to make here that support for UKIP is not the same as support for Brexit. Oftentimes we tend to assume that the whole Brexit vote was a kind of a UKIP writ large, but I think that is not true. 17.4 million people voted for Brexit in 2016, but only 4 million people voted for UKIP in 2015. Right, so unless UKIP had a surge of 13 million voters in that intervening period, which is highly unlikely, that we can't conflate the two, support for the two, even though they're clearly related. Most of these 4 million votes, I think, will be returning to the Conservatives next week, which might also give lie to the idea that Brexit was a revolt of the white working class male who was aged over 50. Another strong interpretation of the Brexit vote, but again, which I think is partly true, but not doesn't do all of the explanation. But it can't be denied that Brexit has reoriented voter cleavages in the UK by highlighting not only socio-economic divisions but national ones too. And I think it's this national element that is worth dwelling upon in terms of thinking about a New Deal or what people want from government. And I've got 3 reasons for optimism that might seem counterintuitive. The first is that Euroscepticism might be good for the EU, even if it is less so for the UK, because it might be generating a realm of opposition that is actually healthy in a body politic. Secondly, and relatedly, populism might actually be good for representative democracy if it leads to a strengthening of the centre. And now, of course, people got quite excited about Macron's win over Marine Le Pen, and we can all breathe a sigh of relief that Le Pen is not president. You know, we don't want a neo-fascist, nuclear-armed neo-fascist at the heart of Europe. But you know, I think the jury is still out on Macron. You know, whether he's I mean, it's better that he won, but of course, you know, is he just offering more of the same medicine what wasn't working in the first place, right? So, and thirdly, that nationalism might also be good for the body politic if it is articulated in a way that aligns with the defence of human rights and individual freedoms. So again, if it's inflected with that sort of post-war optimism of the defence of collective and individual rights. And that leads me back then to the second part of the talk. If I was king of the left, and I sort of pick up from that pause from ABC RN's minefield, because I don't know if you've ever had that experience of stairwell wit, where you kind of think of something good to say afterwards on your way out, and I felt it was a bit like that. But so to pick up on that and answer this question, well, what would I do? Well, if populism is a revolt, then its base might not be so narrow as is commonly suggested. Okay, and what I think this might imply is that there is a gap to be filled, and currently. And that is to do with Peter Mayer's ruling the void and this idea that party politics has been hollowed out. And what it seems clear to me, with the exception possibly of Podemos in Spain and Syriza in Greece, is that actually the right is doing better at filling this void than the left. And this is, I think, partly because having hollowed out politics, it's better placed to seize the ideational dimensions of what remains. Now, I mean, I think, Peter, you were saying that the Labour Party here shouldn't go into government just saying we do better policy. That might be true, but on the other hand, there's something else to be added on top of that that I think resonates with a wider electorate. And I suppose one of the criticisms of Corbyn's Labour is that it is a bit too much for the kind of the converted, preaching to the converted, and what is it doing beyond policies to try and gain those extra voters that it needs to gain in those seats in order to get into power. So I think that something ideational would be well advised. The challenge of the left is to fill this space with its own ideas and ideologies and not leave the field to the right, which has been past practice. And here I am specifically thinking of the English example within the United Kingdom. Because if you'll remember, back in 1997, there was quite a big constitutional step taken in the United Kingdom, which was to devolve power to the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, a London Assembly, eventually the Northern Ireland Assembly. The path to that it was never really smooth, but got there in the end. And of course, the missing piece of that puzzle was England, right? And England did not have its own representation. And we spent a long time waiting. Analysts spent, first of all, politicians expected a backlash, an English backlash immediately. And it seemed not to happen. It seemed not to happen. And that was, but I think that was mistaken. And why I say that is because people were expecting English nationalism to be like Scottish nationalism. They were expecting it to be opposed to the United Kingdom, wanting greater devolution, which various people in England for a long time said they didn't want. And therefore people concluded erroneously that there was no such thing as an English nationalism. My sentiment is that actually there was an English nationalism, it just had bigger fish to fry than the United Kingdom. And what I mean by that was the European Union. Englishness became politicised with three key drivers: resentment at Scotland, resentment at immigration, and resentment at the European Union. So what you got is a kind of resentful populist nationalism. Not a pretty sight, it has to be said. But a lot of people have been saying for a long time is that the Labour Party needs to do more in England. It ignored it. It absolutely ignored England to the extent where perhaps the thing that you will remember is so-called Rochester Gate. Basically, campaigning for a seat which had one of the Conservative defectors had gone to UKIP, and he said that he was going to stand again. He wasn't just going to defect parties, but he was going to seek endorsement from the electorate, and he did, and he got in. Mark Reckless was his name. But in that campaign, a Labour leader, one of the Labour shadow cabinet from Islington, which is the sort of salubrious part of London, came down, took a photograph of an English flag hanging outside someone's house with a white van parked outside it, which is the equivalent of a bogan here, to use that kind of language, and tweeted it, and didn't even need to explain anything to the people. It just said Rochester, October 2014, and she lost her job over that because the snobbery implied in saying, look, this is typical UKIP, they're all nasty English nationalists, they're bloody horrible. Just kind of said it all. And in fact, that contempt carried through. And I think that that's one thing that needs to be rectified. This doesn't mean, of course, and I agree with Peter here, it's masticating and regurgitating the current stew offered up by populist critics of the system. People do want government. That's a basic question. They do want government, but they don't necessarily want to just kick it all the time, I don't think. It suggests countering this kind of populist critique with informed debate, using the new communication technologies employed so effectively by the alt-right, the right and the alt-right in 2016. And I think that, again, that's somewhere where the right were way ahead of the left in terms of teaching the controversy, as they used to call it, about 10 years ago. You just need to undermine these ideas. You don't need to necessarily suggest something else, you just need to undermine them. So what I'm suggesting does imply, and this might take a little bit of getting around, working with rather than against national traditions that animate or sustain public life and create senses of community at various scales throughout and beyond the body politic. The EU experience is pertinent here, I think, because we could scale that up to a global level, that a majority of citizens see the much maligned nation state as the main site of and vehicle for democratic deliberation. So the idea that you were talking about, Julia, I think that still happens at, most people still identify that as happening at the nation state level. So there's life in that old dog yet. Another reason that I come to this conclusion was just purely tactical. I think we're stuck with nationalism and populism. And nationalism, I should say, populism is this idea that there are the elite who are corrupt and there are the people who are pure, and that if you can only sort of drain the swamp of the elite, everything will be better. Nationalism, I think, has two functions. Yes, it's exclusionary, but it's also integrating at the same time. I think we're stuck with certainly nationalism for the foreseeable future, and we need to operate in that terrain in order to counter the right. And I think that one of the reasons I come to this conclusion is that one of the insights of internationalism that theorists of this topic gave us was that although nationalists talk the language of continuity, nationalism itself is a product of change. Right? So it's a product of economic change, social change, political and communicative change. And so the more change there is, the more likely people are to seek to form and restore, if you like, but renew forms of community that are equal to the task at hand. Okay, now, to some extent, we should therefore expect if things are being organised globally, that there would be some sort of concomitant global identity that goes along with that. But we know that global democratic institutions are weak to the point of non-existence. The EU does at least have a parliament, though it is a very weak parliament by comparison. Now, the shortcomings of these two phenomena need little underscoring. Populism is simplistic, nationalism is exclusive, and it leads to concentration camps. Technocrats and Democrats have rightly been wary of these, the forces called forth by the tribunes of such ideologies. Yet we mustn't forget our history here, our own history in this regard, because it wasn't always the case. Sometimes populism, particularly in the 1970s, was a left-wing, not a right-wing phenomenon. Remember how groovy populism was when it was about occupying factories in Portugal? That was a left-wing populism. Nationalism was similarly viewed as a powerful and even a progressive force by people on the left when it was aligned to anti-imperial, anti-colonial movements, particularly in the Third World, or even in Australia when there was a teleology of national becoming. I mean, as late as the Republic referendum, which of course fell down through its own dose of populism. We can't forget that we were a bit ahead of the game there. I know you're making the case that Tony Abbott was our time, but I did wonder if even John Howard might have been our time as well, ahead rather than behind. So I'm not saying that we should adopt nationalism, to court, but to say that the left, rather to say that the left does need to recognise its power and not dismiss it or disdain it, but seek to place or seek to place rational debate above it, but I think rather within it, within those national traditions. And I think that maybe the English and the European experience might be affecting me here. But I think what our concerns are really a critique of power and the status quo rather than the content of the ideologies themselves. It seems that they could be more fluid than we've giving them credence for at the moment, and that we could fill them with some of our own wine rather than having to drink the cheap sherry of someone else, right? So to conclude, a New Deal. If I were king of the left, well, first of all, recognise that there is this gap between the cosmopolitans and the left behinds, and it needs bridging. In other words, we need, if you're ever familiar with this, a new Erasmus scheme. This was a scheme for sending students around Europe so that they would get to realise that different nationalities were not as bad as they'd been brought up to be. But it seems we need a kind of a social one now that puts people in touch downwards rather than horizontally. Re-engage in a battle of ideas over the economy and culture. Don't surrender the economic argument and then ignore the cultural one, because I think that perhaps the left has lost ground in that regard in the last decade or more. Re-politicise the economy, which means leaving behind the third way, but doing so in an idiom that connects macro-level communities and works with national traditions rather than against them. So how might this look in the UK? I think Corbyn is right to prioritise bread and butter issues. In a way, those two campaigns are talking past each other. The Conservatives banging on as much about Brexit as possible, and Corbyn going on about standard of living and so on. But I think that they should be explicitly taking the campaign to the Conservatives over Brexit, rather than ignoring that and just sort of thinking, oh, well, that's difficult terrain because some Labour people wanted to get out as well. I think they should be making more of a case than that. So I hope that's gone some way to filling the void, not just in Peter Mayer's sense, but in the bit of dead air that I left for the ABC a couple of weeks ago. Thank you.